Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Caltech's Making AI Possible. My name's Nick Baudois, Director of AI Programs at Caltech's Executive Education Center, the Center for Technology and Management Education. We deliver courses on campus, on-site around the world, and remotely around systems engineering, AI, and project management, bringing the best-in-class professors from the California Institute of Technology, different researchers from the award-winning and Nobel Prize-winning labs around campus, and also different industry experts in AI and systems engineering and project management. A quick shout out to some of the courses that we have coming up. Our popular AI for Executives, Building a Rapid Organizational AI Blueprint, is relaunching again in October. So if you have a little bit of time, you are in charge of AI decision making, and you're just trying to find out a little bit about the roadmaps and strategies that your organization has to offer. That is a phenomenal 9-hour class remote, and another class that's starting in September called Prototype to Production, Shipping AI That Works, led by Will Kroshorn, who leads Wendy's AI Fresh, which is Wendy's AI drive-through. And then we also have our free course that you can sign up today called AI Tools for Everyone. It walks you through some of the foundations and some of the instrumental baseline around AI. But that aside, let's get into today's session. So the reason for today's theme around building semiconductors, or what we affectionately call as chips, is to understand the infrastructure that AI runs on, and specifically that of the semiconductor. So you've heard from NVIDIA or to TSMC, that the world is awash in these different competitive news clips that highlight the importance of chips in the AI supply chain. But as part of the ongoing conversations that we have on campus with professors and researchers and industry experts in AI, we continuously try to seek to uncover how these systems work in industry. And so I'm very, very excited to welcome both a colleague and a friend and someone who I've known a long time and look up to in the industry, Dr. Anthony Ardizzi, who is a research engineer at the Kavli Nanoscience Institute on campus. KNI, affectionately called, is a cross-industry hub for nanoscale research and technology, and is based on campus on Caltech and also very closely connected with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So little background: founded in 2003 with the support of the Kavli Foundation, the Moore Foundation, it now draws on faculty and researchers from 5 of the 6 academic divisions around campus. So it's spanning photonics, it's quantum engineering, bioengineering, etc. But the best person who can give an introduction to that and himself is Dr. Anthony Ardizzi. So Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Nick. Thanks so much for that great introduction. My name's Dr. Anthony Ardizzi. I'm a research engineer at Caltech and the KNI cleanroom. My research focuses on sort of atomic layer processing, trying to kind of push the limits of what's possible with nanofabrication, in particular applied to specific 3-5 semiconductor devices, which we can maybe get into a little bit more later. But I'm super excited to be here and just sort of talk a little bit about how fabrication processes work, how chips are made, and sort of how that builds into making a chip that is used for AI, and maybe even touching on some quantum topics. So yeah, thanks a lot, Nick.
I kind of feel like we got all the buzzwords out in that opening statement there. So okay, let's really draw it back to kind of first principles. How is a chip made? And I love your analogy, is like starting with raw input, starting with sand. Like, what is going into the chip and how is it constructed?
Yeah, so the vast majority of chips that we think about in computing and computer processing are made using silicon. And silicon, thankfully, is everywhere in the world. If you've been to the beach and picked up sand, there's silicon and silicon dioxide in there. And so that's literally where it starts, is basically with sand. That sand gets kind of ground down and heated very hot to isolate and purify that silicon. And there's sort of specialized high temperature processing methods that are used to extract that silicon, make it extremely pure into these sort of cylindrical ingots, they're called, and then those are cleaved into individual silicon wafers. So, you picture those like circular pie looking wafers. And that's sort of what most people think of as like the starting point for chip processing. From there, how does the actual, how do the circuits get made where, electrons need to actually move around and transistors need to be turning on and off to actually move information around on the chip? And there's sort of three main pieces that you need to think about to make the actual chip that you use. One is lithography. We'll talk about that in a second. Deposition and etching. So lithography, people are probably familiar with the word. You can kind of think about it like drawing the picture on your chip of where the circuits actually need to go. Where do transistors need to get put down? Where do circuits need to get put down? The way that's done is by using specialized masks where you put down, you have your silicon wafer, you put down a special material that is sensitive to a particular kind of light, and you expose that light in just such a way as to reveal the underlying silicon surface that you want to either remove part of or put down something on. So that's kind of part one, is the lithography. You're drawing the picture of where you want things to go. The other two are sort of like inverses of each other, and they're exactly what they sound like. Deposition, you're putting down a material, usually some kind of metal or maybe some kind of dielectric, onto your silicon chip to create some kind of circuit. Or and then alternatively etching, where you're removing material through that lithographically patterned mask. So that's kind of the very basic picture of how a chip goes from sand to silicon wafer to an actual patterned thing that you can think about like that. That is actually what's in your computer chips and video cards and things like that.
And so how long does a process take like that? So say, for example, you have the silicon wafer and you're layering in these. I'm thinking that, if I'm baking something in the oven and I need to layer things, like I'm making a stack of different kinds of Jello or something, is there like a cooling process? Is there a process where you need to wait for it to solidify? Or can you start stacking them on top of each other right away?
Yeah, typically with these kind of materials, everything can happen pretty quickly. It's not like organic materials like food and stuff where, you bake something in the oven and you take it out and it's sort of this slow cooling process waiting for kind of ambient things to happen. With these kind of processes, especially in large semiconductor fab facilities like TSMC and Intel and things like that, I mean, they have such a well-oiled kind of a production line where they can go from lithographically patterning to putting down some material to etching, all within a matter of minutes to hours, of that kind of time scale. There are certain waiting times depending on what you're sort of doing in terms of pumping out and purging different gases and pumping down vacuum chambers. A lot of the waiting time, especially in the work that I do in the clean room, a lot of the waiting time involves you're pumping out a large vacuum chamber. So, these chips need to be processed, obviously, in ultra clean environments. And the clean room itself is a clean starting point. But sort of, you can do a lot better if you remove all of the air from the environment that you want the chip to be in. And so that's kind of a lot of the waiting time, is you put a chip into a chamber and you evacuate everything out so you can very cleanly and precisely do the rest of your processing.
Can you talk a little bit about the facilities that you build these in? So, KNI is about 7,500 square feet. NASA JPL also has different clean rooms that you operate out of. What does the environment look like?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, the environment of a sort of academic clean room is going to be a little bit different from a much larger scale semiconductor processing facility, although the instruments and tools are very similar. So, just like we talked about there's these three, there's lithography, deposition, and etching. So, you to enter the clean room, and you've experienced this, Nick, because we brought you in there. You start by gowning up. You put on this bunny suit that people have probably seen, not too dissimilar to what, surgeons and doctors put on when they go into a sterile environment to do operations. And that's to prevent, oils and stuff from your skin kind of getting into the air and just dirtying the air around your chips. You want to make sure that you're not getting any oils, any dust particles. You wear a mask so your breath doesn't get on your chips. And then you walk into the clean room, and it's kind of, a big lab, often with very yellow lighting, which you've probably seen in the KNI.
I can't imagine spending 8 to 12 hours down there. I'm sure you've got experiences where you come out just like wondering what time of day it is.
Yes, absolutely. You don't want to be spending, too long in a row in there.
And do these just like K&I, do these tend to be underground, or can you have them above ground?
It depends. Some of them are underground. Some of them are just large facilities that are above ground. Typically, again, depending on what part of the clean room you're talking about, you don't want to be exposed to external sunlight for a specific reason that, these lithographic masks that are used are typically very sensitive to UV light. So that, and in large scale chip manufacturing, they use deep UV lithography. So lower wavelength UV light using specialized equipment from ASML. And so if you have sunlight or even just the light from our light bulbs can have enough UV light that they will expose your mask and ruin that pattern that you tried to draw on it.
So within this process, we've talked in the past, especially when you gave me a tour of the facility a couple of years ago. There's different levels of clean rooms. Can you talk about the different levels and why you would have different levels? Say, for example, you are making a spacecraft at NASA JPL and you don't want any microbes from Earth to be able to go on the lunar surface or Martian surface, or you're making a chip. What are the different tiers that you have?
Yeah, great question. It basically comes down to how many particulates can you allow in your environment before whatever you're working on is going to get ruined by that, level of contamination. So the K&I clean room, depending on where you are in the clean room, ranges from class 100, which now these they've updated the classification system. I'm more familiar with the older kind of class 100, classes. Now I think it's ANSI. I can't remember what the new.
We're not going to hold you to it. I'm sure there's.
Don't hold my feet to the
I see a couple of PhDs in the audience already, so maybe you'll in the Caltech lunchroom you'll have to be held accountable. But here we will not hold you accountable.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, but basically what the classes indicate is for particulates of a certain size in the air, class 100 means you have less than 100 parts per million of that particular size of contaminant. And so K&I ranges from class 100 in the cleanest parts of the clean room, where we have the fanciest equipment we have in the clean room are electron beam lithography tools, which I haven't touched on yet. I've talked about using UV light to expose these lithography masks, but you can actually get even more precise than that by using individual electrons to write and pattern your mask. That is not used as much in large-scale chip manufacturing, simply because the throughput is too low. The electron beams, you have to sort of individually write your patterns, whereas with UV, you can use a physical mask and just expose a bunch of UV light through it and make a large pattern very, very quickly.
So kind of similar to developing a photo in a darkroom.
Very similar, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a very, very similar kind of process to that. But yeah, just going back to to sum up the question about the different classes of clean rooms, it really comes down to how much contamination are you able to suffer in your clean room, and the cleaner you need to get, the more air handling, the more turnover, the finer your filters have to be, the more expensive it just becomes to maintain that level of cleanliness. And in a lot of facilities, what they're really trying to do is move away from trying to make the whole clean room as clean as possible, and instead keep your wafers and chips as much as you can in isolated vacuum chambers, and basically never ever even bring them out into the clean room air. Just transfer them from tool to tool without ever having to see the air.
Oh, wow. So within your own work, where do you specifically get involved in this larger process that you've talked about?
Yeah, great question. So for me, I start from the point of receiving a wafer. Now, I'll say I don't really work with silicon specifically. I work with sort of other semiconductors known as 3-5s. In particular, I work a lot with indium phosphide and gallium arsenide. So I will receive a wafer, and from there, I undertake all of the processes we just talked about. I'll start by lithographically, or I'll start by putting down a mask, lithographically patterning that mask. I'll deposit some metal, typically, metal pads where I need to be connecting other things to my chip onto those metal pads. Then I'll remove that mask, and then I'll start again to make the next layer. I'll put down another mask, lithographically pattern my next stage. And typically then for me, the next stage is etching. So the first thing I do, I deposit some metal. Then I need to etch a little bit into my semiconductor surface to isolate different parts of the wafer from each other. Then I remove that mask. And so it's sort of a rinse and repeat. And this is exactly how all chips are made, basically. You do layer by layer, lithographic pattern, deposition or etching, and then on to the next. And so in our research, we make what are called indium phosphide HEMTs, high electron mobility transistors. So we are making individual transistors just like they make in computer chips that are used in computing and AI. But our transistors are sort of a little more specialized. They're bigger. They're not as small as the 5 nanometer, sub 5 nanometer nodes that are being made now.
And just so the audience and myself can understand, when we say 5 nanometers, I don't even think my mind can comprehend the size of that. Can you kind of give us a little, layperson's, guide to how we look at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, the width of a human hair is of the order, I believe, of like a few microns, so micrometers. And so you can kind of get a sense, right? If you look at a hair, you can kind of just see what the width, it's like similar to maybe the width of a sheet of paper. A few nanometers is now 1,000 times smaller than that. And in particular, when you get to a few nanometers, you're talking about scales that are really not much bigger than the actual separation of individual atoms in your semiconductors. So your silicon wafer, right? It's a lattice of silicon atoms, and they're separated by something like a few angstroms, which is 1/10 of a nanometer, so 10 times smaller, roughly, than a nanometer. So we are trying to push chips to processing basically at the scale of individual atoms. And that kind of ties in with maybe the next topic I think that we're going to touch on here, which is atomic layer processing. So,
let's jump into it. You already know the agenda. So let's talk atomic processing.
Yeah. So as these length scale, at these sizes of the transistors and of the circuits get down to these nanometer scales, new techniques need to be developed in order to precisely be able to control how much material you're adding in the deposition processes and how much material you're removing in the etching processes. And so the prime way that people are doing this now is through what's called atomic layer processing, which again has the two connected atomic layer deposition, which has now been around. It's a fairly mature field, several decades old. It's been used ubiquitously in large scale, industrial processing for a while. And then atomic layer etching, which is much newer. It's sort of now just entering, I would say in the last, maybe 5 years or so into large scale production facilities. I guess I should say we don't really know exactly what these facilities are doing, like TSMC and these guys are actually doing, because they keep their fabrication processes very well guarded. But you can sort of infer from companies that make these atomic layer processing tools how they've scaled up their production, that, well, people must be buying these and using them. And so the way that these processes work is typically what you do when we'll talk about etching, since that's probably maybe the more interesting, the newer topic. When you try to etch something, there's a couple ways you can do it. One is you take your semiconductor and you dip it in a liquid, and that liquid chemically reacts. It's an acid or something. It chemically reacts with your semiconductor, and it removes material while you have it in the liquid, and then you take it out, and that stops your etch. That's like the oldest, etching method that we discovered, hundreds of years ago, and it works well in a lot of cases if you just kind of need to do things quick and dirty. But it's not nearly precise enough for the kind of, nanometer processing we're talking about. The next step up from that is let's say generally plasma processing, where you put your chip into these vacuum chambers that we talked about before. You ignite a plasma, which is sort of a special state of matter where there's a lot of high energy atoms flying around, and you shoot those atoms down at your surface, and they hit the surface hard and physically remove stuff from your surface.
Kind of like sandblasting it.
Yeah, basically like sandblasting. Often it's called ion milling. You're literally shooting ions at your thing and just blasting off material. That actually surprisingly works quite well. And is people have developed processes to control that pretty well, but it is not nearly precise enough for this nanometer scale control we're talking about. And so that brings us then to atomic layer etching. And the way atomic layer etching works is, rather than just blasting away at your surface, you split your etching into kind of two steps. First, you introduce some chemical that reacts with just the surface of your material and kind of weakens, in some sense, that top layer, literally just that top atomic layer of your surface. So you have atoms coming, they bond with the surface, and now you have this self-limiting process where the entire surface is coated in this modified surface layer. Then you can come in, and instead of just blasting away, you come in with a much more gentle, it can be an alternative chemical, or you can still do a gentler kind of physical etch that removes only that modified layer and leaves the underlying layer completely pristine. And this gives you a few really big advantages. The one is it allows you to control the depth of your etching. So how far are you etching down? You can control it to the atomic level. So basically, as precise as physically possible. You can't remove less than an atom from the lattice. You either removing atoms or you're not moving anything. The second big advantage for large scale processing is that, in principle, you should get perfect uniformity over very large scale, arbitrarily large scales if you have a large enough chamber. So, if you modify the entire surface and then slowly remove that entire surface, now you have a full surface that you've etched one atomic layer. The disadvantage is that it's typically a lot slower than these other processes. And so that's sort of the give and take, is how precise do you need this this sort of change in surface versus how long can you tolerate, how long it's going to take.
And how many layers are we talking about on average? I know
Yeah.
that's probably a very
Right.
general question, but
No,
I'm trying to
that's a
visualize how deep we're going.
yeah. It completely depends on what kind of process you're talking about. So, you know, typically what people will do is, let's say you needed to etch, 20 nanometers.
Hmm.
So that's something like a few hundred atomic layers. You can do the bulk of that with one of these other processes, maybe wet etching where you physically dip it, or physical etching. So you can kind of more quickly over the course of, let's say, I don't know, order of 20 minutes or something like that. I'm just kind of throwing out a number. It's somewhere between a
Right.
few minutes to maybe an hour, etch them most of the way. Then since the atomic layer processing kind of side of things is slower, you can then take, your last few atomic layers that you need, maybe like 100 or a couple hundred, um, and slowly remove those last few nanometers. So we're talking typically scales of nanometers, down to even sub nanometer, like a few angstroms or a few tenths of nanometers.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's not, we're not doing this it's much smaller than you could physically see with your eye. It's not like you can look and see, oh, I see the layers getting removed. It's nothing like that. It's much smaller than you can see.
So what's the trade-off between doing this atomic scale fabrication versus kind of the more traditional fabrication that you
Mm.
introduced the show with?
Yeah. So, well, I should say, they're complementary, right? It's sort of like atomic layer processing is sort of like the next evolution.
Mm.
There's traditional deposition methods, and there's traditional etching methods. And then if you need that sort of ultra precision, that's where the atomic layer versions of those come in, where you're slowly doing layer by layer. The big trade-off is speed, but for chips and devices where you need to pack as many transistors into as small a space as possible. You want to push them to basically their physically smallest possible limits, where you have,
Mm.
each transistor is only like a few hundred atoms, of that scale. And so atomic layer processing kind of is the only way we know of to precisely control, um, uh, deposition of metals and etching of semiconductors at that scale. Yeah.
So this is kind of a good transition to the final phase. Is we hear a lot about quantum engineering. Can you kind of give a lay of the land on where do we start entering the world of quantum? How does that start diverging or interacting with quantum computing? Like, where is the synergy between that for us lay people who are not working each day in a fabrication lab?
Yeah, great question. So, you can kind of think of these two sort of parallel technologies in some sense. What we've been talking
Mm-hmm.
about is purely semiconductor stuff, silicon, in my case, indium phosphide and these other semiconductors. Quantum is then sort of its own special class of just different materials. We're not talking about silicon anymore. We're talking about maybe aluminum, niobium, materials where, in order to get these special quantum properties out of them, we have to cool them down very, very cold,
Mm.
using these specialized refrigeration techniques. Maybe some of your audience is familiar and they've seen these dilution refrigerators that are in all these quantum labs, and those really are those huge cylinders that you see. It's all to carefully cool down a series of stages down to the very bottom, where you have your quantum chip that's just a tiny little chip similar to a semiconductor chip. It's all cool down to that. And quantum is kind of special in that, when I talked about atomic layer processing from the semiconductor perspective, the most useful thing is trying to push the size of things down as small as possible and get the most control over large wafer scales as possible. In the quantum regime, quantum devices are so physically sensitive to everything. Any kind of electromagnetic noise that could be coming in, which is again why these big dill fridges have special, EMI blocking metal containers and things. But at the scale of the quantum chips and the quantum devices, which you can think about in many ways similar to these semiconductor chips that I was talking about. I mean, the processing steps are all the same. You're still doing lithography, you're depositing something, the materials are different. But they, in particular, are extremely sensitive to the exposed surfaces. So if you make a quantum device, you need to make sure that the surfaces that you leave behind that are exposed to other, whether it's the vacuum around it or interfaces between different materials, if those are not atomically precise, your quantum device the performance is going to suffer. Your qubits, if people are familiar with what qubits are going to have worse decoherence times. You're going to have way less time to do the quantum processing you need to do. And this is where atomic processing is so powerful for quantum devices. And it's one of the biggest, in our research group, we do a lot of research on atomic layer etching, recipes and processes applied to quantum materials, precisely because that atomic layer etching enables you to very precisely and cleanly control the interfaces and outsides of those devices. So that's sort of the physical picture you can kind of think about.
No, that was a terrific explanation. And I still had many composite parts that hadn't really gone together. All right. So if you do, for audience members, if you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A. I'm not going to go through chronological order, but I'll try to put these together, Anthony, so they make a little sense. All right. First question that we have is back to our clean room conversation. So this is about the classes of the clean room. So it says, is the clean room class based on a standard volume or the entire clean room? So as in, would a class 100 clean room be less than 100 particles in the entire clean room? And does that impact the size?
Yeah, great question. It typically, you define an area of your clean room that is of a certain class. So, I'll use the KNI as an example. There's a particular room in the KNI clean room where we house our electron beam lithography tools. That is class 100, and in that entire room, the particle count has to be below the threshold to meet that class. So you could have an arbitrarily large space and say that, and if you do all the filtering and air turnover and everything, you can have that entire space be class 100 or class 10 or class 1. It becomes extremely expensive to do so, and people typically try to keep the spaces as small as possible that they need to keep clean. But yeah, when you talk about a class, you're talking about some space, some room or set of rooms, and that is the whatever class it is.
Could you have a scenario where, you talked about bringing silicon wafers from machine to machine, where inside a certain machine is registered as its own class? Like, I don't know, I'm making this up, class 50 or something like that.
Yeah. Typically, we won't talk about inside tools as being of a class something, because inside the tool, there should really be no particles that we think of in terms of in the air around us. Once you go into a processing tool, that tool should never have been basically exposed to the particles that we have in the air. Inside that tool should only be the processing gases that you need to have in there. Maybe I should say it a different way. There is some level of contamination that you will have in those tools, but the kind of contamination is not the same as the dust particles in the air. It's more of like, do I have a gas in there, like oxygen is a big killer, that I don't want in there right now, but just because it's hard to pump it out, it kind of sticks around on the walls. Yeah, so I think that's a better way to think about it. It doesn't have classes in the same way that the clean room does. It has its own set of contamination that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I think an important question is how is the manufacturing or the fabrication of chips for, let's say, your general, I don't know, Intel or MacBook Air different from the chips that you're making for, say, GPUs or various AI computing processes?
Yeah, okay. So sort of the question is, how does sort of GPU AI chip manufacturing
Exactly.
differ from like CPU
Exactly.
computer? Fundamentally, it's really no different. All of the processes are exactly the same. Um, the difference comes really in the architecture of the chips. So from a fabrication perspective, the whole picture I gave you is pretty much exactly the same between the two different things. You're doing lithography, you're putting stuff down, you're etching stuff. The difference, and this is not my area of expertise. You got
We
you
won't hold
maybe,
you to it. You
yeah,
know, this is
don't hold me to
only
it.
this is only recorded, put live on YouTube and
Yeah.
Spotify and
Oh,
iTunes. So yeah,
geez.
you're safe, right?
Yeah, yeah. The difference really comes in the architecture of the chips, how they're laid out, how the different transistors interconnect with each other. In sort of a broad picture, GPU architecture is optimized to do tensor computations very
Mm-hmm.
efficiently. So, addition, subtraction, multiplication, like the fundamental operations that are required to run large language models and really do a lot of things. That's what, and I learned this recently. The name GPU, graphical processing unit, is kind of a misnomer at this point. It only comes from that historically we've used these GPUs or video cards to process the video signal that gets sent to our monitor that we look at. But now they're really more correctly named tensor processing units because what they're optimized for is doing tensor calculations very quickly. A CPU is more optimized for running the operating system and doing sort of file organization and accounting for the computer. It can also do computations quick and efficient, but that's not really what it's fully optimized for. Hopefully that kind of
No,
answers the question.
that's a really good explanation, and it's always kind of fun to look down in history and say, okay, when was the first GPUs? And you look at it as the gaming community, and I
Yeah.
remember getting my first GPU and calling my brother who's a gamer. I'm like, man, can you help me spec this laptop out? Like, I have no idea what I'm looking at, and so
Yeah.
it's incredible how folks who were playing Counter-Strike in the late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah, right. A lot of us are now finding that when our parents told us there's no future by playing a lot of video games, it looks like there was. Well, Anthony, how does somebody follow your research? How do they stay up to date with K&I and kind of the cool things that are happening in that area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely check out the KNI website. There are sort of webinars, seminars, and events that are posted there that people can learn about and check out. If you are, someone who is kind of has some need to do some kind of processing. The KNI is trying to attract industry users to come check out the facilities and see if it would be interesting for you. I believe we are going to start offering, or maybe already do, sort of if you need a process run but you can't physically come to the KNI and do it. Reach out to us because we have people who can run processes for you. I'd say check out the website in terms of our research. So I'm in Professor Austin Minnick's group, so you can check out his research website and see some of our recent publications.
I am putting in links, so if you see me ferociously typing here,
Perfect.
Let me just get Professor Minnick's group, and I'll pop it right into the chat for those who are online. All right, Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time today. If you are interested in any of the courses, which tend to feature speakers like Dr. Anthony Ardizzi or different researchers in the labs or different professors on campus and industry experts, please contact us at Caltech CTNE. You can look on caltechctne.edu and be happy to chat. Anthony, I will see you around campus.
Thanks so much, Nick. Take
All
care,
right, thank
everyone.
you. Bye.